Hi, my name is Asako Nagai. I'm a managing director of BSR based in Tokyo. Thank you for your joining today and taking time for this session. I'm here to share our learnings about emerging issues around technology and human rights. But first of all, let me introduce BSR. BSR is an organization of sustainable experts that works with global network around the world. We work with world-leading companies on sustainability. We have a member of more than 300 companies. We have a mission to work with business to create just and sustainable world. We have offices around the globe, North America, EMEA, and Asia, including Tokyo and Singapore. I'm currently leading BSR technology sector practices. Our technology sector member are more than 80 companies. We work with global leading technology companies. That includes Meta, Google, Microsoft, and Samsung. Here is today's agenda. I'm going to start with what are human rights, and then talk about technology and human rights, and share some case study to illustrate what technology and human rights mean in practices. So, what are human rights? Human rights are identified and defined clearly under the International Bill of Human Rights. Those include Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights, International Covenants on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, ILO Core Labor Principles, and other convention includes rights of the child. So Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I often refer to, and as we often call UDHR, have the 30 codes that identified some of the human rights, including rights to equality, non-discrimination, rights to life, and freedom of slavery. Those are the human rights defined under the UDHR. UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, UNGP, defined what it means to the business community, and it is issued in 2011. It defines that states have a duty to protect human rights. Companies have a responsibility to respect human rights. Individuals whose rights are hurt must have access to remedy. UNGP has become the global standard for the business community to refer to when implementing the business and human rights to the company. So what are technology and human rights? Brad Smith of Microsoft quoted, "When your technology changes the world, you bear responsibility to help address the world you have helped create it." So the key message here is under the UNGP, companies have a responsibility to respect all human rights. This means assessing human rights impact and taking measures to avoid, prevent, or mitigate adverse human rights impacts. And companies should prioritize human rights effort to those of the severity of the rights holders. And company should pay attention to, particularly to individuals from vulnerable groups. And company can take action on human rights, both alone and in collaboration with others. So the non-human rights impact for technology sector or companies can be defined here as an employer or as a purchaser of services and as a service provider. And there are examples of non-human rights impact for technology companies as employer, as a purchaser of services, and as a service provider. Here is some technology services and human rights. When we say technology, there are a lot of technologies out there, but we particularly pay attention to new, emerging, and disruptive technology defined on the left-hand side corner that include AI, machine learning, Internet of Things, big data analysis, robotics, 5G, biometric recognition, including facial recognition, sentiment analysis, human sensing, blockchain. And when we say relevant human rights issues or impact relevant to technology services on right-hand side, including privacy, freedom of movement, freedom of expression, and non-discrimination. For the AI, we're using AI, for example for AI. We're using AI for many things, and we're using every day, including e-commerce for marketing and ad use, social media services for posting and content moderations, AI for detecting risk for driving. We are in a world we cannot avoid not using any single technology which lay out here, and for even for any moment for every day. So I'll give some example for what is a human rights issue for a little bit, for example, for AI. There could be a privacy issue. There are 3 raw data privacy areas: government access to data, commercial use of data, nefarious use of data. And for discrimination, AI models are designed to sort and filter, which can result in discrimination when it leads to output that are unfairly biased towards certain groups. Freedom of expression association, AI system can be used in a way that both directly and indirectly impact free expression, freedom movement. The potential for AI to be restrict movement is directly tied to potential for the surveillance, for example. And bodily security of rights. Some AI applications have the potential to use in a way that results in physical harm. Access to essential services. AI systems are used to facilitate access to essential services, such as social security and benefit of human health insurance. Access to remedy. Victims of human rights violation have the right to remedy for the harm they have suffered, but the remedy to harm linked to the use of AI system can be difficult to provide due to the lack of explainability, transparency, and accountability. So there are already some examples how things can go wrong. Things can go wrong in multiple different ways. A pacemaker that could be hacked, alter this prescribed therapy for the patient, wearable tech devices that does not work for people of color, company developed a technology that allows for racial profiling, facial recognition used by the border agent to identify undocumented migrants, AI misidentification that leads to wrongful address. Those are an example how things could go wrong. I'll give you some case study in the following session, but I will not describe one by one. The first one is the recently settled case in U.S. Arizona state for location tracking lawsuit. The cases of location tracking lawsuits of user that has been settled recently. Another case study for the Myanmar shutdown in the internet. This has been for the telecommunication company that the government has ordered to shut down the internet, and that has resulted in the human rights violation for the people in Myanmar to violate the access to information, access to internet, and access to freedom of expression. So those cases is not limited to technology company, but they're toy company examples that the toy company are using, increasing more AI powered toy and that could have a potential meanings to human rights of the child. Another case study from the beauty industry, that the beauty industry is also starting to use AI for their products. So the question here is not only towards technology company, but also for non-technology company as well. How do we respect human rights and prevent adverse human rights impact? This is the question for technology and non-technology company that needs to take action to human rights and defined under the UNGP, human rights to avoid, prevent, mitigate human rights. We are together with a company in the journey to work with company to work on those challenges. Thank you very much for your listening. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation to speak to you today about the topic of 5G and human rights. My name is Theo Jekyll, and I'm the Director of Business and Human Rights at Ericsson. And today I will give you a brief overview of the report and assessment that we conducted last year that's also available on our websites. So I have a few slides that I will go through that give you an overview both of our approach to business and human rights and specifically the methodology and the findings of the 5G human rights assessment. So I hope you can see my slides now and we'll go through them together. So just to start, to give you an overview of the approach that Ericsson has taken to business and human rights. This slide gives you an overview of how we implement our commitment across the company and across our value chain. So the basis for how we work with business and human rights is, of course, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. This is our overarching commitment, and this is what we also implement and base our strategy on. So as you can see at the top here, we have a company-wide human rights program and commitment that cuts across all our business areas, market areas, and group functions. Then we also implement our human rights strategy and commitment through different due diligence processes and frameworks that are designed and geared to addressing risks at different parts of our value chain. So the blue boxes that you see on this slide are the main due diligence programs that we have in place. So we, of course, have a responsible sourcing program dealing with issues in our supply chain. We address human rights risks in our own operations and for our own employees. And then we have what we call the sensitive business process, which is how we address human rights risks in sales and end use of our technology. Then at the bottom here, there are, of course, programs and efforts that we have in place that cut across our entire value chain and all of these different processes. And that's conducting human rights impact assessments, which can be triggered by a country human rights impact assessment. It could be specific technology or the assessment on 5G that we conducted last year and that I will talk more about. We also have, of course, our allegation management system where human rights are included. So anyone, both internal and external stakeholders, if they have human rights concerns, they can use our allegation management system and grievance mechanisms to raise those concerns. And then we also, of course, work with training and communication, especially to key job roles and personnel that are facing human rights challenges and need to be aware of our commitment and strategies. So if we go straight into then the 5G human rights assessment, just to give you some background on why we did this and how. So this report that we published last year was the first comprehensive human rights assessment of 5G. We've previously as a company mainly focused on country-specific human rights assessments, but this time being a leader in 5G technology and seeing the need for assessing human rights at an early stage of the rollout, we decided to take a different approach and focus more on the technology rather than specific country operations. The reason also for doing this at an early stage, as I mentioned, is to demonstrate a proactive approach to addressing risks. Learnings from the previous assessments that we've conducted are very clear that if you conduct these assessments early on, if it's early on entering into a new country, for example, or early on developing a new technology, that enables you to better build leverage with your stakeholders instead of waiting for risks to materialize. The aim of the assessment is definitely to be a starting point for engagement and for further discussions. It's not going to be exhaustive, or it's not exhaustive. It's from an Ericsson perspective and from the perspective of what we know at this time. And the report itself is hopefully, and that's how we've been working with the report since it's been published, a first step in ongoing due diligence measures and further engagement with stakeholders. The methodology of the assessment is just as any other human rights impact assessment that we conduct, is based on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So that means it covers our entire scope of responsibility as defined by the UNGPs. That means a full value chain approach. So sourcing, own operations, and use of technology. And of course, the focus is outcomes to people and how we deal with those risks. The assessment was conducted in collaboration with Shift, which Ericsson has been working with for a very long time. Shift is a leading expert organization on business and human rights, the team that worked with John Ruggie in developing the UN Guiding Principles. So they helped us with the methodology and also engagement with external stakeholders. And as you'll see, the assessment is divided into 5 different sections that cover our value chain, and each category goes into more detail on the types of risks that we see, the mitigations that we already have in place, and where we need to put in additional measures and work with other stakeholders across the ICT ecosystem. Talking about the ICT ecosystem, this is an important picture to keep in mind when talking about risks in relation to 5G technology. It's not just a straight value chain, it's really a ICT ecosystem with different players that play different roles in addressing the risks. So as you can see on this slide here, Ericsson is the network vendor. We mainly deal with our customers, the mobile operators, but of course interact with the other entities and stakeholders in this map as well. So we've always kept this, even though this is a simplified view, we've always kept this in mind when we worked with the assessment to make sure to really assess who are the key stakeholders depending on the risk, and who do we need to engage with, whose awareness do we need to raise, how can we build leverage and address the risk across this ecosystem, because the risks are not going to be addressed just by the vendors. Everyone in this ecosystem, of course, needs to take their responsibility. This slide here, which I will go into a little bit more detail, just gives you an overview of the type of risks that we identified. So these are the different chapters. So as you can see, it's a broad range of issues, everything from livelihoods and job transitions to supply chain impacts, but also network surveillance and shutdowns. And I'll go into each of these in a little bit more detail to give you an understanding of the type of risks that we've identified. So if we talk about our own operations, we see different types of risks, mainly, of course, related to, for example, livelihoods and job transitions with increased automation that will be enabled by 5G. There is, of course, a potential impact on workers, employees, both blue-collar and white-collar workers. How do you prepare for that job transition? Reskilling workers, providing other opportunities, and so on. We, of course, also have occupational health and safety issues, climbing towers, installing equipment, and so on. On the supply chain side, of course, many of these risks exist already today, so not all of them are new, such as, of course, labor risks related to the supply chain, but we focused in the report really on what materializes in a new way. So, for example, the 5G rollout will increase demand on specific minerals, and those minerals might be sourced from high-risk areas. So how do we prepare for that kind of increased risk and addressing it at an early stage, preparing our supply chain, and so on? But of course, other risks related to labor, such as already existing in our industry, forced labor, excessive overtime, living wage, and those types of issues are, of course, still relevant. On the customer side, we also have, of course, a wide range of issues cutting across the value chain. For example, privacy data and loss and misuse. So with 5G and an increased amount of data that will be generated in 5G networks, there is, of course, also an increased risk of that data being misused. So how do we put in privacy protections in the technology from already in the development phase? With 5G networks also becoming more and more critical networks, there is, of course, potential impacts if those networks fail. So how do we protect with cybersecurity measures and so on? And then we have the issue of network segmentation and differentiation, and how do we make sure that even though that's possible and a positive development in 5G, how do we make sure that that's not abused in a way that people don't get access to critical services, for example. When we talk about engagement with governments, we of course have issues related to both network surveillance and network shutdowns. These are issues that we are already addressing through our sensitive business framework. But again, we're looking at how these issues materialize maybe in new or increased ways through 5G. Again, the issue of more data also, of course, enables to paint a more precise picture of people's behaviors, movements, and so on, and that could be misused. So we, of course, need to make sure that only authorized authorities, for example, can have access to that under certain circumstances. The same thing goes with positioning, for example, with more precise positioning also opens up for the risk of misuse of that positioning data. On network shutdowns, this is already an issue that our industry is very focused on, and preventing shutdowns and making sure that the connectivity continues. And with 5G technology, we're looking at how to prevent more kind of precise or targeted network shutdowns that could target specific groups or groups of stakeholders, for example. And then if we talk about broader societal impacts, we've of course looked at the issue of connectivity. So everything from how we can make sure equal access, both between rural and urban areas, but also equal access between countries, and how that enables critical services from anything from healthcare to education, all of these issues that have been very front and center during the COVID pandemic, of course. Making sure that there is equal access and affordable access to these services. And then we also look at trustworthy AI and how human rights impacts can be addressed when dealing with AI systems that will be very critical in 5G networks, both in the network itself, but also what the network enables and other types of AI functionalities. So how we can ensure that there's human oversight, trustworthiness in the system, avoiding bias in AI systems, and a transparent way of how the AI systems operate. So all of these issues are, of course, now at a very high level, and just an overview of the topics that we cover in the report. The report, as I mentioned, is much more extensive and goes into detail on how we've addressed these issues, how we see need to address them through other stakeholder engagements. So the report is available on our website, and I really recommend you to read it if you want to dig deeper into some of these issues. Then just to maybe wrap up and talk about next steps and how we've been working with the report now since it's been published, and some of the learnings that we've seen. One, of course, topic that I've already mentioned is, the issues are not unique to Ericsson. Even though the report itself and how we wrote it, it's from an Ericsson perspective and from a network vendor perspective. Many of these issues are relevant for operators, for platform companies, for governments, for end users, of course. So our hope with the report is that this can raise awareness and get other actors in the ICT sector to start thinking about what is their role in addressing these risks. We We also here clarify our responsibility as a vendor, what we can do and what we can't do, and where we need support from other stakeholders. And that's also what we've been doing now since the report was launched, to try to work with them to find joint ways of addressing these risks. Another, of course, positive outcome is that we now have a good baseline. There will be new risks emerging, of course, throughout the life cycle of 5G, and now we have a good opportunity to identify them early on and address them in similar ways. And the next step, and what we've been doing as well, is more in-depth stakeholder, especially with potentially affected stakeholders across our value chain, to understand their perspectives on the issue. So with that, I'll stop presenting, and I hope that this has given you a bit of an overview of the work that we've done, and hopefully, if you want to learn more, you can do so on our website, and please feel free to reach out if you have any further questions or you want to discuss this topic in more detail. Thank you.
Good day, everyone. My name is Samantha Ndiwalana, and I'm a senior researcher at the World Benchmarking Alliance. I'd like to thank Jipyong LLC for having me and my colleague Samita Thapa here today. I'd like to start by sharing my screen. The World Benchmarking Alliance was founded as a non-profit organization with the mission to identify, assess, and incentivize the world's 2,000 most influential companies and to hold them to account for their role in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs. To do this, we take a transformational approach because we believe that it will take a system to change the global economic and development system. We work with the 7 systems transformations, which organizes the global economic and social system into 7 transformations, of which the digital transformation is one. That's the circle with the blue outline and the different colored segments on the screen. The next step is to select industries of inclusion. We identify the most relevant industries that can positively or negatively impact the transformation by focusing on their influence. For example, while many companies produce electronic devices and equipment, and they have an important role in enabling the digital transformation, e-waste, the product of this production, is also one of the fastest growing waste streams in the world, with a significant portion of this waste ending up in landfills. And therefore, the electronics manufacturing industry is also important for the nature and biodiversity transformation. Next, we identify keystone companies that form part of the SDG 2000. WBA's list of the world's most influential companies for achieving the SDGs. We use identifying criteria such as whether the company dominates global production revenues or volume, does this company have influence on global governance processes, or whether this company has a global footprint, particularly in developing countries. With all of this in place, the next step is to develop benchmark-specific methodologies and publish free and publicly available benchmarks on company performance. We then empower stakeholders, including our allies, investors, and governments, to use our findings in their advocacy and decision-making. WBA shows what good corporate practice looks like so that leading companies have an incentive to keep going and laggards feel pressure to catch up. In this way, we create a race to the top, setting out what companies need to do so that all of us can have a more resilient future. Here you can see some of our donors, some of our funding partners. As mentioned, our work is free and publicly available, and this is possible with their support. The digital inclusion benchmark assesses the world's 200 most influential digital technology companies across several industries, as you can see, from telcos to hardware to e-commerce, even semiconductor companies. Our benchmark has a global reach. We cover more than 175 economies, as you can see on the map. $4 trillion in revenue is what our companies have, and they employ more than 10 million employees. Here you can have a quick look at the results of the 2021 and the 2020 iteration of the benchmark. This year is our third iteration of the benchmark, where we will be assessing 200 companies. Something that's interesting to note is that Samsung, an engaged Korean company, is showing progress over time in how they're performing in terms of digital inclusion. This shows the importance and the benefits of engagement in the benchmark. So we are looking forward to hearing from some of the companies present today. We want to know how we can support you on your digital inclusion journey. The benchmarking process begins with methodology development. First, we published a scoping report and held global consultations with governments, thought leaders in the space, and other leading organizations to develop our methodology and our scoring guidelines. The benchmark is structured into 4 measurement areas and 16 indicators. The first area is access. You can see it in that puzzle image on the right. Access looks at company efforts to help people access digital technologies. For example, companies that are providing access to technologies for vulnerable groups such as women and girls. And we also look at the efforts they are taking to make their products and services accessible to users with disabilities. The second measurement area is skills, which covers company programs that support and enhance digital skills. These can be programs looking at basic digital skills, such as teaching seniors how to use computers, all the way to more technical digital skills, such as coding and engineering. The next piece of the puzzle, and the third measurement area, is use, which looks at company efforts to help users feel safe and comfortable enough to use digital products and services online. It covers topics such as whether companies have senior level oversight for cybersecurity, whether they disclose their data breaches, and if they have a high level commitment to protecting their younger users against child online abuse. The last measurement area is innovation, which covers company efforts to innovate in an ethical, inclusive, and sustainable way. It covers topics such as whether a company supports open source innovation, whether the company supports the SDGs through their research and partnerships, or, for example, whether a company has publicly available ethical artificial intelligence principles. And this last topic is something we found is quite important to investors. This year, in addition to the main digital assessment, companies will also be assessed on a set of core social indicators. So if you remember that image of the 7 systems transformations in the second slide, that red circle in between is a social transformation. It sits at the heart of our work. Here you can see the core social indicators at a glance. There are 3 pillars and 18 indicators. All WBA's benchmarks include the core social indicators. The 3 pillars are act ethically, provide and promote decent work, and respect human rights. And these indicators look at company efforts to achieve universal human development by respecting human rights, promoting equality, and empowering people to pursue opportunities and choices that they value. So this was a quick introduction to the Digital Inclusion Benchmark. We hope to hear from you if you have any questions or you'd like to engage further. I now hand over to my colleague, Samita Thapa, and she will introduce you to the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark.
Thank you, Samantha. Hi, everyone. I'm Samita Thapa, and I'm happy to be here to present the work that we've been doing on human rights at the World Benchmarking Alliance. I will also be sharing my screen. The Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, or the CHRB, sits within the WBA's social transformation, which is, as you can see, at the heart of all the other 6 transformations. Our core social indicators that my colleague previously mentioned focuses on scale, assessing 2,000 companies on whether they're taking the first steps towards respect for human rights. But the CHRB, as a spotlight benchmark, aims to catalyze change by going beyond policy commitments to hold companies accountable for their performance and progress on the path to respecting human rights. Companies are collections of people, whose decisions and actions impact other people. So it only seems right for companies to put people at the heart of what they do, and for the WBA to put people at the heart of corporate benchmarks. The CHRB focuses on assessing human rights commitments and performance of 230 companies in high-risk sectors. The sectors identified so far are food and agricultural products, apparel, extractives, automotive manufacturing, and ICT manufacturing. We assess companies' publicly available information based on our methodology that is available on our website and produce individual company scorecards outlining their performance against our benchmark methodology. We also provide companies an opportunity to give feedback on our research during the company engagement period, which we see as a key aspect of the benchmark when it comes to explaining the standards, but also to better understand how companies operate and where the gaps exist. After receiving the company feedback, we finalize the company scorecards, which are then made freely available on our website for all stakeholders. So how did it start? 2 years after the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights were adopted, the CHRB was initially set up by a multi-stakeholder coalition composed of institutional investors, civil society organizations, independent business and human rights experts, and an ESG rating agency. You can see some of the organizations involved on the slide. Starting from 2017, the CHRB started to publish annual benchmarks. By now, with several years of data, we're able to identify trends, track progress of companies and sectors, and see where gaps continue to exist. In 2019, the CHRB was formally integrated into WBA, making it one of the oldest benchmarks that we publish. So why the CHRB? In 2011, after the UNGPs were officially endorsed, there was no way of measuring whether companies were actually following the UNGPs. So the CHRB assessments work as an accountability mechanism with public rankings and scorecards, leveraging the competition to improve corporate performance so that the leaders are incentivized to do more while the laggards are motivated to catch up. Key stakeholders can also use the benchmark data and findings along with their influence to drive improved corporate human rights performance. With our methodology, we hope to provide companies and also other stakeholders with a roadmap, helping them understand what is expected of them. The structure of the methodology for the CHRB includes around 50 indicators, including sector-specific indicators across the 5 measurement areas that you can see on the slide. Measurement Area A looks at governance and policies, looking at general human rights commitments and board oversight of the respect of human rights. Measurement Area B, which makes up 25% of the overall score, looks at the embedding of respect and human rights due diligence. Measurement Area C looks at remedies and grievance mechanisms, and D looks at performance and human rights practices. For example, for a D indicator, this is where we look at whether a company aligns its purchasing practices with its human rights commitments and the practical steps that it takes to ensure that. In addition, this section also looks at sector-specific risks. So for ICT and automotive manufacturing companies, one of the indicators looks at responsible sourcing of minerals and risk identification in mineral supply chains. Measurement Area E is where we look at serious allegations of negative human rights impacts against companies. And this measurement area accounts for 20% of the company's overall score. We receive these allegations from external sources, such as print media, NGOs, news websites, and governmental agencies. And we look at incidents covered by VGO IRIS, the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, and RepRisk. Looking at allegations is extremely important to us because it allows us to look at sources beyond the company self-reporting and get closer to the impacts on the ground. After the assessment has been finalized, we publish the results of the benchmark on our website, which is publicly available, and it includes the ranking of the company, the key findings report, a detailed individual scorecard, and a data sheet. Once the results are published, they're used by a variety of stakeholders, like companies, investors, governments and international organizations, and academics. And in terms of investors, they regularly reach out to us to go over company scorecards before engaging with the companies, but also in 2021, the Investor Alliance for Human Rights released a statement on behalf of 208 investors representing over $5.81 trillion in assets under management, calling on companies to improve their recent performance in the 2020 CHRB. So as you can see, I hope this gives you a helpful overview of the corporate human rights benchmark, and this is what you can expect as next steps for the CHRB. Unlike previous years, the CHRB is now following a biannual cycle, assessing 3 sectors this year and 2 additional sectors next year. On the 21st of November this year, we will be publishing the results of our 2022 assessment of the 3 sectors at the UN Business and Human Rights Forum in Geneva. The 3 sectors are food and agriculture, ICT manufacturing, and automotive manufacturing. In 2023, we will be assessing extractive and apparel sectors and will publish the results in the last quarter of the next year. Thank you so much for listening, and if you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We look forward to engaging with you.